The soft lavender dress seemed almost to glow against the cold, metallic hues of the terminal. 11-year-old Amira Collins held her boarding pass tightly, her small fingers trembling slightly as she looked up at the security officer in front of her. The man loomed above her, his expression twisted with annoyance, and something deeper, something that made Amira's stomach sink. All she'd done was politely ask where her gate was, but in a matter of moments, everything had spiraled beyond her control. Now, the officer's hand was closing around her boarding pass, and as he yanked it from her grasp, Amira knew with a certainty no child should ever feel. Something was terribly wrong. What she couldn't have known was that this moment, this terrible, bewildering moment, would ripple far beyond Gate 6B. It would set off a firestorm across the country, exposing cracks in one of the nation's most powerful institutions. Amira had flown alone before. Her parents had walked her through every step. She knew the routine like a song. But nothing could have prepared her for the second the officer's voice thundered through the terminal. "This is clearly fake. You're not boarding anything today." The bustling terminal seemed to freeze. All movement slowed, except Amira's hand, which reached into her coat pocket with a strange calmness. She took out her phone. Her fingers moved automatically, dialing a number she'd memorized when she was 6. She lifted the phone to her ear, and with a voice steadier than even she expected, said 4 words that would send a shiver through the entire Department of National Safety. "Dad, I need you." The days that followed would grip the nation. It would ignite conversations about race, power, and the unseen mechanisms behind security lines. Shocking revelations would come to light about policies no one wanted to admit existed. But at its heart, this would always be the story of a young girl in a lavender dress, standing her ground in a moment when most adults might have folded. At the headquarters of the Department of National Safety, Director Malcolm Collins slipped his ID badge into the inner pocket of his suit. He moved briskly through the building, nodding at staff as he passed. At 48, Collins exuded the calm authority of someone who had handled crisis after crisis and still kept his compass steady. His navy suit was perfectly tailored, concealing the disciplined frame of a former Navy officer. Silver at his temples gave him a distinguished air, but today there was no time for reflection or politics. His mind wasn't on national threats. It was on his daughter. "Sir, the Secretary of Defense is on line 1, his assistant called as he passed her desk. "Tell him I'll call back in 10, Malcolm replied without slowing. "My daughter's flight lands in 3 hours. I promised I'd be there." He smiled briefly at the thought of seeing Amira again. His wife, Dr. Lena Collins, had stayed in Halston an extra day for a medical summit. Since Amira had been begging for more independence, they'd agreed to let her fly back alone, just this once. "I'm practically 12, Dad," she'd insisted. And while her birthday was still months away, Malcolm had finally said yes, booking her ticket as an unaccompanied minor with every safeguard possible. What he didn't know, what none of them could know, was that at Lakeside International Airport, a TSA agent named Connor Blake was starting a shift that would soon change everything. At 36, Blake had been with the agency for nearly 15 years. Once eager to serve, his idealism had eroded over time. After being passed over for promotion again and again, resentment had quietly settled into his bones. Checkpoint 2. Today, his supervisor called out, barely glancing up from the roster. Blake nodded, jaw tight. Checkpoint 2 was the worst. Busy, chaotic, and unpredictable. As he walked past the break room bulletin board, his eyes caught a photo. A framed portrait of Director Collins, positioned among other high-ranking officials. He stared at it for a moment. Then he looked away, the muscles in his face unreadable, as thoughts swirled quietly in his mind. Back in Halston, Amira zipped up her lavender carry-on bag, her excitement barely contained. Her mother, Dr. Lena Collins, adjusted the collar of her daughter's coat and brushed a curl behind her ear. "Phones fully charged?" "Yes, Mom." "And remember, don't talk to strangers. Stay with the flight attendants until you're through security. Call Dad the moment you land." Amira nodded, reciting it like a checklist. "Stay close. Stay calm. Call Dad. I got this." Her mother pulled her into a long, proud hug. Amira's lavender dress was a special purchase, chosen just for this trip. To her, it represented more than style. It represented growing up. And in just a few hours, it would become something else entirely. Lena pulled Amira into a final, lingering hug. At just 11, Amira was already showing signs of the extraordinary woman she would grow into. Sharp, self-assured, and grounded in a fierce sense of right and wrong. That lavender dress had been more than a fashion choice. It had been a statement of her growing independence. "I know you've got this, sweetheart," Lena whispered, brushing her daughter's cheek before letting go. "Your dad will be waiting right at the gate. He cleared his whole afternoon just for you." What none of them realized was that their perfectly planned day was about to collide with something far more powerful, a system shaped by years of bias, now about to be exposed by the most unlikely person, an 11-year-old girl in a lavender dress. The morning flight from Halston to Dunridge went smoothly. Amira spent most of it buried in her favorite novel, a spy story about a kid uncovering government secrets. The flight attendants checked on her often, charmed by her poise and thoughtful curiosity. As the plane began its descent, she peered out the window at the Tower of Liberty in the distance. Her heart swelled with pride, knowing her dad worked in this city, helping keep the nation safe. After landing, a smiling flight attendant walked her to the final security checkpoint, the glass barrier separating the gate area from the main terminal. It was the one place her father couldn't cross, so Amira would have to go through alone. "You're all set from here, honey," the attendant said with a warm smile. "Just show them your papers and head straight ahead." Amira nodded, clutching her ticket and the ID badge her dad had arranged for her to travel solo. She approached the checkpoint. Officer Connor Blake stood behind the podium, glancing over travel documents. When Amira stepped forward and offered hers with a cheerful smile, Blake barely acknowledged it until his eyes froze on her ID. A shift, subtle, sharp. Something in the situation triggered him. Maybe it was the unaccompanied black girl in designer shoes. Maybe it was something deeper, a quiet bias he'd never questioned, never named. "Where are you coming from?" His tone was different, sharper, suspicious. "Halston, sir," Amira replied, her smile fading slightly. "And who are you visiting?" The words came not as a question, but as an accusation. "My mom's at a medical summit. She's a heart surgeon." Amira blinked, confused. No one had said she'd have to explain her trip like this. Blake stared at the documents again, his brow furrowing. Then his eyes flicked between the papers and Amira. "This doesn't look right," he said coldly. "Where did you get this?" The airline? Amira answered, confused and now a little scared. I just flew in. I was on Flight 206. By now, a few other officers had noticed the exchange. None stepped in. Behind her, passengers were growing restless. Step aside, Blake said, pointing toward a waiting area. Amira obeyed, her chest tightening. This wasn't supposed to happen. Her dad had walked her through everything, every step. Nothing in the plan included this. I think there's been a mistake, she said, trying to stay composed. My dad is waiting for me, just outside the terminal. And who, exactly, is your father? Blake's tone was skeptical, icy. Amira hesitated. Her parents had always told her not to bring up her father's job, unless absolutely necessary. But this wasn't just anyone. He was an officer. She was alone. And she was starting to feel genuinely afraid. He's Director Collins, she said quietly. He works for the Department of National Safety. Blake's face twitched. Was it disbelief? Annoyance? Something else? Sure, he said with a smirk. And I'm the president. The burn of humiliation flushed through Amira's face. People were watching now, some curious, others uncomfortable. I'm telling the truth, she whispered. Blake leaned in. Young lady, using fake credentials is a federal offense. And pretending to be connected to government officials? That doesn't help your case. Before Amira could respond, Blake did something that shattered the last illusion of professionalism. He tore her boarding pass straight down the middle. The sound of it ripping was impossibly loud in the terminal. This is fake, he declared for everyone to hear. You're not going anywhere today. Tears welled in Amira's eyes. Fear surged. But alongside it, something else rose. Anger. Righteousness. The knowledge that this wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was wrong. With shaking hands, Amira reached for her phone. Amira raised her phone with hands that were still trembling, but her voice, steady, strong. I want to call my father, she said, surprising even herself with the calm in her tone. Go ahead, Officer Blake muttered, waving his hand dismissively, clearly not taking her seriously. Amira never looked away from him as she dialed. When the call connected, she spoke clearly, her voice cutting through the buzz of the terminal. Dad, I need you. I'm at the security checkpoint. An officer tore up my ticket and says I'm lying about who I am. The change in Blake's expression was almost cinematic. Slowly, the color drained from his face as a commanding voice responded on the other end of the line. Amira held the phone toward him. He wants to speak with you, she said simply. 20 minutes later, Director Malcolm Collins stepped into the terminal like a thundercloud, moving fast, with only minimal security accompanying him. He wasn't just walking. He was cutting through the crowd, people parting instinctively as he passed. Airport staff rushed to keep up, barely hiding their panic. By the time Malcolm reached the checkpoint, Officer Blake had already been pulled aside by his increasingly flustered supervisor. A hush fell over the area as dozens of passengers paused to watch. Malcolm dropped to one knee and gathered Amira into his arms, searching her face for signs of distress. His embrace was fierce, protective. Once she nodded that she was okay, he stood, his full height, his full presence. His voice, though quiet, struck like thunder. Who is responsible for this? No one who heard it would forget it. That moment would become the spark, the catalyst, a single incident that would unravel decades of unspoken practices buried deep within airport security systems. But for Amira, still nestled in her father's arms, the only thing that mattered right then was that she was safe. The worst had passed, or so she thought. By that evening, the story had already leaked. News outlets were scrambling, each trying to piece together what had happened. Details were still murky, but one explosive fact was in every version. A black child, the daughter of a high-ranking government official, had been profiled and publicly humiliated at an airport checkpoint. For the Collins family, this wasn't a media story. It was personal. And now, it was unfolding in real time, live on national television. In their living room, Amira sat between her parents, watching the coverage with wide eyes. Lena reached for the remote. "Maybe we should turn this off," she said gently. "No," Amira answered, voice firm. "I want to know what they're saying." Malcolm and Lena exchanged glances over her head, but didn't push the matter. On screen, a panel of commentators debated whether the incident was an isolated mistake or evidence of something much deeper and systemic. The network cut to security footage. Amira, in her lavender dress, visibly confused, then distressed, as Officer Blake confronted her. The image had already become symbolic. "They keep showing my dress," Amira said quietly, "like it matters what I was wearing." Malcolm's arm tightened around her. "People focus on the wrong things," he told her. "But what matters is this. You stood your ground. That took more courage than most grown-ups have." "I was scared," she whispered. Lena smiled gently. "Being brave doesn't mean you weren't scared. It means you did the right thing, even though you were." The coverage kept rolling. Some voices accused Amira of exaggerating. Others questioned whether Malcolm's position had influenced the rapid suspension of the officer involved. Across town, Connor Blake sat alone in his dim apartment, watching the same footage. His face, frozen on screen, mid-motion, caught tearing up a child's boarding pass. He'd been placed on administrative leave hours earlier. His badge was gone. His clearance revoked. For now. His phone buzzed endlessly. Colleagues, reporters, old friends suddenly interested in his version of events. He ignored every call. Because the truth was, he didn't know what version to give. Had he truly believed her documents were fake? Or was it something else? A judgment made in a blink. A reaction built over years of unchecked bias. And as Blake stared at the television, his face reflected in the darkened screen, a painful realization settled in. He had treated that child as suspicious, not because of anything she did, but because of everything he had been conditioned to believe. And that belief had just exploded across every news outlet in the country. What had happened to Amira Collins at Dunridge International wasn't unheard of, but it was unusual in one key way. Her father's position meant it couldn't be ignored. As Officer Connor Blake stared at his own reflection in the darkened screen of his TV, a memory surfaced, one he hadn't thought about in years. It was from his early days at the agency. A senior officer had gathered a small group of rookies, including Blake, for what he'd casually referred to as an unofficial orientation. The officer's words rang in his ears now, clearer than ever. The handbook says, treat everyone the same. But let's be real. We all know who the real threats are. You'll learn to spot them. At the time, Blake had taken it as street-smart wisdom, veteran insight. Now, he saw it differently, as the beginning of something far more dangerous. A quiet indoctrination that had, over time, trained him to distrust people who looked like Amira, automatically, unquestioningly. The realization turned his stomach, and with it came a heavier question. If this mindset had been passed around like a secret handshake, wasn't the problem bigger than just him? If the system had quietly taught suspicion, shouldn't the accountability stretch beyond one disgraced officer? At the Collins household, dawn had barely broken, but the house was already humming with quiet activity. Malcolm had been up for hours, reviewing early reports and fielding calls. In the kitchen, Lena sat at the island, scrolling through a flood of messages from friends, colleagues, and concerned strangers. Amira, despite her parents' gentle suggestion to take the day off school, was zipping up her backpack. "They're going to talk about it anyway," she said, practical and composed. "I'd rather be there to tell my side." Lena studied her daughter. Still so young, yet standing with the poise of someone far older. "Are you sure, sweetheart? It's okay to take time. You've been through a lot." Amira's voice was steady as she clipped her bag closed. "I'm sure. Plus, we have a math test, and I studied all week." Malcolm entered just in time to hear her. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "That's my girl. Just remember, you don't owe anyone your story. Not if you don't want to share it." "I know, Dad," Amira said, looking up at him with eyes that seemed older than yesterday. "But I'm not ashamed. I didn't do anything wrong." As the family gathered their things to leave, Malcolm's phone buzzed. It was his deputy, Jordan Reyes. He stepped into his office, closing the door halfway. His voice, once full of warmth for his daughter, now shifted. Cool, clipped, focused. When he rejoined Lena and Amira, his demeanor had changed. Not angry, not emotional. Official. "What's going on?" Lena asked, reading his face instantly. "We'll talk more tonight," Malcolm said, "but Jordan's early review is turning up things beyond Connor Blake." "Like what?" Lena pressed. "Patterns, inconsistencies in training, maybe even unwritten directives, things that sound like policy but never show up on paper." He glanced at Amira, now adjusting her headband in the hallway mirror. "It's bigger than one bad judgment call." Lena took it in quietly, the way a seasoned surgeon processes new data mid-operation. "Be careful, Malcolm. If this goes where I think it's going, it's not just policy, it's politics." "I know," he said. "But if the system's broken, we don't just patch it, we rebuild it." Their conversation ended as Amira called out, "I'm ready." The ride to school was unusually quiet, each of them lost in thought. As they pulled into the drop-off lane, Amira hesitated, her first moment of uncertainty that morning. "Dad, do you think that officer hated me because I'm black?" The question hit the air like a glass about to shatter. Malcolm turned to face her, choosing his words with care. "I don't think Officer Blake even knows you well enough to hate you, Butterfly," he said gently. "What happened yesterday, that was about his assumptions, his biases, not about who you are." He paused. "Some people carry ideas about others just based on what they see, and sometimes they act on those ideas without even realizing it. But that's about their limits, not yours." Amira thought for a moment. "Like when Mrs. Palmer didn't believe I knew all those astronomy facts, because she didn't expect me to care about space?" "Exactly like that," Lena nodded. "Bias comes in a lot of forms," she added, "some small, some very harmful. But what matters most is that you always remember who you are. You're not defined by someone else's narrow view." Amira nodded slowly. then reached for the car door. "I think I get it," she said, then smiled with a sudden burst of energy. "I'm going to be an astronaut, and a heart surgeon, and maybe run the Department of National Safety, too." Her parents laughed, relief and pride breaking the tension for just a moment, and as they watched her walk through the school doors, still in her lavender dress, and still entirely herself, they knew. Whatever the system had tried to reduce her to, Amira would always rise beyond it. As Amira walked through the school doors, head held high, Lena reached for Malcolm's hand. "She's going to be okay," she said softly, perhaps more to herself than to him. "Better than okay," Malcolm replied. "But that doesn't mean the work is over." The day unfolded along two very different paths for the Collins family. At school, Amira faced a mix of whispers, curious stares, and awkward silences from classmates unsure how to react to someone they'd only ever seen as just Amira. Across town, Malcolm was in a secured meeting room at the Department of National Safety, surrounded by key advisors. The investigation was widening, and what had begun as a disciplinary review of one officer was now exposing something far more troubling. Patterns in training, in complaints, in culture. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Lena, chief of cardiovascular surgery, fielded discreet questions from colleagues. Some were supportive, others not so subtle in their curiosity. For Officer Connor Blake, the day was entirely different. He sat alone in his apartment, waiting for the inevitable. As he prepared for a preliminary hearing with Internal Affairs, his phone lit up with a number he didn't recognize. Against his better judgment, he picked up. "Blake, it's Mitch Granger, his former supervisor." Connor's stomach turned. "We probably shouldn't be talking," he said quickly. "That's exactly why I'm calling," Mitch cut in. "Things are moving. Fast. They're bringing in an outside team. Not just to look at you. They're pulling logs, training materials, complaint records, all of it." Blake went quiet. Mitch continued, his voice tight. "People are going to start scrambling, covering themselves. And if you're not careful, you'll be the scapegoat for a much bigger mess." Blake sat down slowly on the edge of the couch. "What are you saying?" "I'm not saying anything," Mitch replied, measured. "I'm just giving you a heads up. If I were in your shoes, I'd think real hard about who knew what, and when." The call ended, and for a long time, Blake didn't move. He understood exactly what Mitch was implying. There were things he could share about unofficial training, about whispered best practices that no one put in writing. But doing so meant implicating not just himself, but people who had trained him, people he once respected. What had started as a simple disciplinary review was now becoming something else entirely, a crossroads. Would he protect himself or help fix the damage? Back at school, Amira's day brought a different kind of challenge. Some teachers tried too hard to act normal. Others avoided eye contact, unsure of what to say. Her classmates were split, some supportive, others simply uncomfortable. A few, as kids sometimes are, leaned into cruelty out of confusion. At lunch, Amira sat between her two best friends, Liana and Miles, who had quietly declared themselves her bodyguards for the day. Then came Tobias Marsh, a sixth grader with a reputation for sarcasm and sharp words. "So," he said, sliding up to the table, "you're famous now?" Miles narrowed his eyes. "Back off, Tobias." Amira raised a hand gently, calming her friend. Then she turned to Tobias. calm and direct. My dad didn't come because I'm special, she said. He came because what happened was wrong. It would have been wrong if it happened to anyone. The only difference is that most kids don't have someone in power who can do something about it. Tobias blinked. Her tone wasn't defensive. It was just honest. Whatever, he muttered. But instead of walking away, he hesitated. Then in a quieter voice, he asked, "Were you scared?" When he started yelling, the shift in tone caught Amira off guard, but she nodded. "I was really scared," she said. "I didn't understand why he was so angry. I hadn't done anything wrong." Tobias didn't say anything for a moment. Then, almost under his breath, "That sucks." He turned and walked away. "That was weird," Liana whispered. "He's usually such a jerk," Miles added. Amira looked down at her tray, then back toward Tobias disappearing down the hallway. "Maybe," she said thoughtfully. "He just needed to hear what it was really like, not what they're showing on TV." It wasn't a big moment, but for Amira, it marked a subtle shift. From survivor to storyteller, from victim to advocate. She was beginning to understand the power of her voice, and she was just getting started. By the time the final bell rang, Amira Collins felt emotionally drained, but also strangely empowered. She had fielded more questions than she could count. Some thoughtful, others clumsy. She corrected rumors, clarified facts, and even found herself explaining the difference between implicit and explicit bias to a curious social studies teacher, a concept her parents had talked to her about long before this incident ever happened. When Lena pulled up outside the school, she was surprised to find Amira deep in conversation with the principal, Dr. Hargrove. "I only want you to do this if you're comfortable," Dr. Hargrove was saying as Lena approached. "But I think your insight would really benefit our student council as we explore issues of inclusion and community." Amira turned with excitement. "Mom, Dr. Hargrove wants me to speak to the student council about what happened. Can I?" Lena exchanged a glance with the principal, her instinct to protect flaring up. "That's a big step, Amira. Why don't we talk about it more at home?" "Of course," Dr. Hargrove said warmly. "There's no pressure. The invitation is open whenever, or if ever, she's ready." On the drive home, Amira was animated, bubbling over with details from her day. The unexpected support, the odd, awkward moments, the difficult questions that turned into deeper conversations about justice and perception. "Even Tobias asked if I was scared," she said, her voice still full of disbelief. "Tobias, he never cares about anyone but himself." Lena listened intently. What she noticed, more than anything, was how her daughter was processing the experience, not just reliving it, but shaping it into something she could make sense of, something that could help others. It was healthy, remarkable even. Still, Lena remained quietly watchful. She knew the adrenaline of public attention could fade fast, and the emotional weight might land differently in the quiet days that followed. Back at home, they found Malcolm in his study, mid-conversation, with Deputy Director Jordan Reyes. Amira burst in before anyone could stop her. "Dad! Miss Reyes!" Her face lit up as she saw Jordan, who had been a regular presence in their home since Malcolm's appointment. Serious and sharp in meetings, warm and funny at the dinner table. Jordan's expression softened immediately. "There's my favorite Collins," she said, kneeling for a quick hug. "How was school?" "Busy," Amira grinned. Everyone had questions, but most people were actually nice. "That's because you're inherently likable," Jordan teased. Unlike your dad, who scares half the cabinet. Malcolm chuckled, though his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Why don't you go fill Mom in on your day while Jordan and I finish up this very boring adult conversation? Amira gave him a knowing look. She was young, but not oblivious. Still, she nodded and left with Lena. As the door clicked shut, Jordan's expression turned serious again. We need to move fast, she said quietly. The evidence is piling up, and some of it goes back more than a decade. Malcolm leaned forward. Are we talking about unofficial protocols? Jordan nodded. Nothing in writing. But the verbal directives, the informal trainings, they were widespread. We've already identified 5 supervisors, including Blake's direct superior, who kept these practices alive. Malcolm absorbed this with a heavy stillness. His jaw clenched. This is going to blow back, he said. People are going to accuse us of overreacting, of using my daughter's story for leverage. With all due respect, sir, Jordan replied firmly. This isn't about optics. It's about constitutional rights. If we have proof that federal employees have been consistently violating those rights, then it's our responsibility to act, no matter the political cost. Malcolm studied her. At 39, Jordan had already built a reputation for brilliance and tenacity. Some had dismissed her early on as too idealistic, but Malcolm had seen something rare in her, a spine of steel wrapped in uncompromising principle. You're right, he said finally. We move forward. But we do it smart. The moment this becomes political theater, we lose any chance of lasting reform. Their conversation was cut short by Lena entering the doorway, her face unreadable. I think you both need to see this, Lena said, holding out her tablet. Malcolm and Jordan moved closer, their expressions shifting as they took in the screen. A single image had begun circulating online, a stylized illustration of a young black girl in a lavender dress standing before a looming faceless figure in uniform. The background was muted. The girl's dress was vibrant. At the bottom, in bold, simple text, it read, "Standing in lavender." It's gone viral, Lena explained. People are using it to share their own stories about profiling, harassment, being made to feel less than at security checkpoints. Malcolm stared at the screen, overcome by a storm of emotions. Pride in Amira's courage, a deep, aching concern about her transformation into a national symbol, and the weight of a growing realization. This moment could lead to real, lasting change. But only if they acted quickly. We need to launch a full-scale review of our security practices, Malcolm said, turning to Jordan. Not just this incident. Everything. Training, oversight, complaint procedures, how officers are evaluated. We bring in civil rights leaders, independent reviewers, people from outside the system. Jordan was already writing. I'll draft the framework, but we should expect pushback, from inside and out. Let them resist, Malcolm said quietly. This matters more than convenience. That evening, as the Collins family sat around their dinner table, Amira finally asked the question that had been forming in her mind all day. Dad, what's going to happen to Officer Blake? Malcolm exchanged a long glance with Lena before answering carefully. That depends on the investigation, Butterfly. But there will be consequences. What he did wasn't just wrong. It violated both protocol and your rights. Amira nodded, then looked down at her plate. I've been thinking about it all day. At first, I was just scared. and angry. But now I keep wondering, why? Why did he look at me and decide I was lying? Lena's voice was gentle. That's not an easy question. The truth is, some people carry deep invisible biases based on things like race, gender, even age. And sometimes those biases affect how they treat others, even when they don't realize it. Amira looked up. So, if he was taught to think that way, then maybe just punishing him won't really fix anything. Her parents were stunned into silence by the clarity of her observation. You're absolutely right, Malcolm said softly. That's exactly why we're not just dealing with one officer. We're looking at the whole system. Amira gave a small, thoughtful nod. Good, because not every kid can call their dad when something like this happens. The system should be fair from the beginning. Her words lingered long after the dinner plates were cleared. From the mouth of a child had come the clearest, simplest articulation of what justice truly meant. Not just punishing the guilty, but fixing the broken. Across the city, Connor Blake sat alone, staring at the walls of his apartment. The decision he'd made earlier that day still sat heavy in his chest. He was going to tell the truth. Everything. Not to excuse his actions, but to ensure that accountability didn't stop with him. That those who had built and maintained the quiet culture of profiling and bias would be forced to answer for it too. There was no comfort in the choice, no relief. Only the grim clarity of someone who understood that he was choosing the least wrong path in a landscape of bad options. He found himself thinking again about Amira, her steady voice, her terrified eyes, her courage in a moment when every adult around her had failed her. He made another decision, one not about the investigation, but about humanity. If he ever had the chance, he would apologize to her. Not to be forgiven, but because harm needed to be named before it could be healed. Over the following days, the story surged forward. Blake's testimony was submitted to investigators, and it was damning. He detailed the quiet, unwritten profiling system that had taken root at Dunridge International, and as more officers came forward, at other airports as well. No official memos, no paper trails, just patterns, passed down in break rooms and whispered between trainings. The public response was overwhelming. The hashtag, Standing in Lavender, had become more than a slogan. It was a movement. Civil rights groups stepped in, offering resources and support. Survivors of similar experiences began to share their own stories of being pulled aside, interrogated, dismissed, or humiliated for no clear reason. Security experts weighed in too, with some warning that dismantling biased practices might compromise national safety. Malcolm challenged that narrative directly in a now widely quoted public statement. There is no trade-off between safety and equal treatment under the law. Bias does not make us safer. It makes us blind. It misdirects attention and wastes resources. True security protects everyone equally, or it protects no one at all. The idea that we must choose between security and equal treatment under the law is a false choice. True security cannot exist in a system that routinely violates the rights of the people it claims to protect. Bias doesn't make us safer. It blinds us, wasting resources on appearances instead of actions. These were Director Malcolm Collins' words, broadcast nationally and quoted across platforms as the movement grew. His message was clear, firm, and personal, one shaped by his daughter's courage. But with attention came pressure. To protect Amira, the Collins family made a difficult decision. She would step away from the media spotlight. No interviews, no press conferences. Just a child returning to school in routine. With one exception, she would speak at her school's student council meeting, supported by her parents and moderated carefully by Principal Hargrove. Amira stood before a small group of peers and teachers, her voice calm and sure. The scariest part wasn't just being afraid, she explained. It was realizing someone could look at me and not see me at all. Just assumptions about what I must be, about whether I belonged, about whether I could be trusted, and then use those assumptions to treat me like I didn't have the same rights as anyone else. The room was still. Then a seventh-grade boy raised his hand. "But how do we fix that?" he asked. "Like, when people don't even know they have bias?" Amira nodded thoughtfully. "My mom says awareness is the first step," she said. "You can't change what you don't admit exists. And after that, you build systems that don't just depend on one person doing the right thing. You put checks in place, so everyone gets treated fairly, no matter who they are." Her answer, simple yet profound, landed deeply with her classmates and the teachers who had come to observe. Later, Dr. Hargrove would tell Lena that Amira had done more to teach structural bias in 30 minutes than most curricula manage in a semester. While Amira found her voice in unexpected ways, the investigation continued to expand. What began as a probe into one officer's misconduct had evolved into a sweeping review of airport security systems nationwide. Malcolm assembled a special task force composed of both civil rights advocates and national security professionals. Their mandate was clear: rewrite the rules, root out bias, and create accountability structures that couldn't be ignored. The effort wasn't welcomed by everyone. Some within Malcolm's own department feared the political fallout. Others accused him of using personal tragedy to fuel a political agenda. External critics were louder, accusing the reforms of political correctness, claiming they would weaken national security. But Malcolm stayed focused, guided by his daughter's insight that a system that protects only some cannot truly protect anyone. He kept moving forward. 6 weeks after the incident, an unexpected request came in. Connor Blake, whose testimony had become central to the widening investigation, had submitted a formal request to apologize to Amira in person. The message was carefully worded. Blake understood if the family declined. He also offered to write a letter instead. The decision, he made clear, was entirely theirs. At the Collins home, the request sparked an intense and emotional conversation. Malcolm's immediate instinct was no. His daughter had suffered enough. But Lena, equal parts protective mother and practiced physician, believed in the power of resolution if Amira was willing. They agreed. The choice belonged to her. "I want to hear what he has to say," Amira said, after thinking quietly for a long time. In person. Malcolm studied her. "You don't owe him anything, Butterfly. Not your time. Not forgiveness." "I know," she replied, "but I have questions, and maybe it'll help me understand. Not just what he did, but why." There was a maturity in her tone that stopped both parents in their tracks. After outlining ground rules, location, security, legal oversight, they agreed. The meeting would happen at a neutral site, a Department of Justice conference room with safeguards in place. Blake arrived alone. He looked smaller than he had on the airport cameras, thinner, nervous, hollow-eyed. The Collins family entered together, Amira between her parents, chin lifted, still wearing lavender. She didn't flinch. Blake stood as they entered, but didn't approach. "Thank you for agreeing to this," he began quietly. "I know you didn't have to." He looked at Amira, then away, as if the sight of her made the weight of his action sharper. "What I did at the airport was wrong. There's no excuse. I profiled you. I didn't listen. And I made you feel unsafe when it was my job to protect." Amira Collins stood between her parents, her chin lifted despite the knot of nerves in her stomach. Across from her sat Connor Blake, noticeably leaner than he had been in the airport footage. His suit hung awkwardly. His hands trembled slightly. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," he began, voice uneven. He looked directly at Amira for a split second, then dropped his gaze, as if the sight of her made his shame sharper. "I want to apologize for my actions at the airport. There's no excuse for the way I treated you." Amira didn't respond immediately. She watched him carefully, her expression unreadable. Blake turned to Malcolm and Lena. "I've been thinking a lot about that day," he said. "At first, I told myself I was just following protocol, being thorough. But that wasn't the truth." He took a breath. "Something happened the moment I saw Amira. Assumptions. Things I didn't even know I was carrying. I can't ask for forgiveness, but I wanted you to know. I see it now, and I'm committed to changing." A heavy silence followed, thick with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Malcolm spoke. "Acknowledgement is a necessary first step, Mr. Blake. But meaningful change takes more than regret. It takes action, sustained effort, accountability." "I understand, sir," Blake replied, his voice quieter. "That's why I've joined the reform initiative your department is developing. If my mistakes can help stop this from happening to another kid, I want to be part of that work." Lena, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. "Do you have children, Mr. Blake?" The question caught him off guard. "Yes, ma'am. 2 sons, 14 and 16. "Then maybe," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. "You can imagine what it would feel like if someone in authority treated your boys the way you treated our daughter." Blake's face flushed. He swallowed. "I think about that every day now, Dr. Collins." Amira had been quiet the entire time, listening, not just to the words, but the tones, the silences, the discomfort. Then she spoke. "I was really scared that day," she said, her voice steady. "Not just because you were mean, but because I didn't understand why you thought I'd done something wrong." She paused, choosing her words. "My parents taught me that when something isn't fair, you speak up. So, I'm glad this is all happening. Even though it's hard, maybe it'll help other kids not feel scared, like I did." Blake nodded, clearly moved. "I hope so too, Amira. I really am sorry for making you feel that way." The meeting ended shortly after. There were no hugs, no handshakes, but something had shifted. It wasn't reconciliation, not yet, but it was recognition, and that mattered. In the weeks and months that followed, the reforms sparked by Amira's experience began to take root. New training protocols were launched at major airports, designed to teach officers how to recognize and counteract their own unconscious biases. Complaint systems were restructured for transparency and accessibility. Independent oversight panels were put in place, staffed with civil rights experts and community voices. Though no longer employed by the agency, Connor Blake chose to remain involved, speaking candidly about the culture that had shaped his actions. He helped develop real-life training scenarios, lending insight into how subtle bias could quickly become damaging behavior. His cooperation didn't undo the harm, but it helped illuminate the system that allowed it and offered a path forward. As for Amira, life slowly returned to something resembling normal. The media attention eventually moved on, and her name faded from headlines. She returned to her favorite routines: science club, piano lessons, and weekend bike rides with her friends. But she wasn't the same. She saw the world a little differently now, with more awareness of the quiet, invisible forces that shape how people are treated. And out of that awareness, something new began to bloom: a fascination with civil rights history. What had started as a way to understand her own story soon became a passion. She began devouring books about justice, protests, constitutional law, asking questions with depth far beyond her years. The books kept piling up on Amira Collins' nightstand: civil rights history, landmark court cases, biographies of legal pioneers. What had started as an attempt to make sense of her own experience had grown into a genuine passion. "I think I want to be a lawyer," she announced one evening over dinner, "or maybe a judge." Her parents shared a smile. "That's a shift," Malcolm noted. "Weren't you planning to be a marine biologist just last month?" "I still might," Amira said, with the certainty only youth can deliver. "I'll do marine biology during the week, civil rights law on weekends." Lena laughed. "Well, you've got the drive for two careers, but maybe start with finishing 6th grade. As the 1-year anniversary of the airport incident approached, the Collins family faced a decision. How would they acknowledge it? Some organizations reached out, hoping Amira would participate in public forums, panels, even commemorative events. Others gently suggested that the family preserve their privacy. The final decision came from Amira herself. She proposed a compromise. She would write a brief statement to be shared through her father's office, but no interviews, no cameras. The day itself would be marked privately, with family. Her message was simple but powerful. "1 year ago, something happened to me that was scary and unfair, but it led to important changes that help protect other kids and families. I'm proud of my parents and everyone who worked to make things better. I'm still learning about justice and how we treat each other. But I know this: speaking up when something is wrong is always the right thing to do, even when it's hard." The statement spread quickly, drawing attention for its grace and clarity. Many were moved by how a child's voice had sparked so much change. But what the public didn't know was that Amira had asked for one more way to commemorate the day. She wanted to wear the lavender dress again, not to relive the pain, but to reclaim it, to wear it not as a symbol of vulnerability, but of strength. That morning, she emerged from her room in the same dress that had once made headlines. It was now a little snug, but still bright, still hers. Lena adjusted the collar gently, her throat tight. "Still fits?" she asked softly. "Sort of," Amira admitted. "But I wanted to wear it, to show I'm not afraid anymore." Malcolm knelt, taking her hands. "You never have to be afraid of being who you are, butterfly. And we'll never stop working to build a world where that's true, for every child." They walked together to school, Amira in the lavender dress, her parents by her side. To anyone passing by, it may have looked like an ordinary morning. But in truth, it marked a full circle, a quiet reclaiming of power, and a reminder of how far they had come, and how much farther there still was to go. The incident at Dunridge International Airport had begun as a personal trauma, a mistake, a moment of harm. But over time, it became something more, a case study in how courage, accountability, and advocacy can begin to reshape broken systems. For Amira, the girl who once made a single steady phone call that changed everything, the journey was far from over. She carried with her a deeper understanding of injustice and a growing belief in her ability to confront it. As for Director Malcolm Collins, the experience had changed him too. Where once he had balanced national responsibility with personal instinct, now those two forces had merged into a single, focused mission: to build security systems that did not compromise dignity, not in theory, but in practice. The reforms sparked by Amira's case continued to ripple outward, across agencies, through institutions. What began as a response to one child's mistreatment became a larger reckoning about how power is exercised and how people are protected. As Amira approached adolescence, and as Malcolm and Lena balanced demanding work with devoted parenting, their lives slowly found a new rhythm. But they would never forget that their most painful moment had also become their most transformative one. The lavender dress, once a symbol of fear and injustice, had been fully reclaimed. It now stood as a quiet reminder of resilience and the power of speaking truth to power. For Amira Collins, the girl whose calm but powerful phone call had ignited change, the future felt wide open. Not because she was the daughter of a national leader, but because she had found her voice and chosen to use it. Whether she became a marine biologist, a lawyer, or something entirely different, she would walk that path with the confidence of someone who had seen injustice, stood up to it, and helped transform it into an opportunity for something better. At airports across the country, new security practices were now standard. Training modules, revised screening protocols, transparency procedures, all influenced by the lessons born from a single event. Most travelers never knew the story behind these changes, but those who did remembered the girl in the lavender dress and what her story proved: that sometimes the smallest voice in the room could spark the most significant change, and that justice, though often slow, was always worth fighting for. The story that had begun with humiliation and fear had grown into one of courage, accountability, and systemic reform. And it was far from over. The second year after the incident brought new challenges and growth for the Collins family. Now approaching her 13th birthday, Amira was navigating the complex social maze of middle school. She was no longer just a student. She was often still recognized as that girl from the airport. The media buzz had died down, but the impact of what happened hadn't. For Amira, the experience had become part of who she was, at times a burden, but increasingly a source of purpose. Her interest in civil rights had deepened. What started as curiosity had become focused determination. And one evening at dinner, she unveiled her newest project. "We're starting a student club," she said, beaming. "It's called Youth for Equity. Every month we'll take on a different issue. We're kicking off with bias in school discipline policies." She handed a printed proposal to Lena, who raised an impressed eyebrow as she read through the pages. "This is incredibly well thought out," Lena said. "You even have a monthly outreach calendar." "I had help," Amira admitted. "Ms. Reyes showed me how to format it. She says half of change is organization." Malcolm smiled knowingly. It was clear that Jordan Reyes, his sharp and principled deputy director, had become more than a professional ally. She'd become a mentor to Amira. While some parents might have been alarmed by their preteen diving into school policy reform, Malcolm and Lena understood. Amira wasn't being pulled away from childhood. She was growing into the kind of young person her experience had shaped her to become, and they didn't want to reverse that. Just remember to make time for fun, too, Malcolm added gently. Advocacy is important, but being a kid matters too. Amira rolled her eyes in mock exasperation. Dad, organizing for justice is fun. For me, at least. Her parents burst into laughter. That spark in her, the mix of determination and self-possession, had always been there. The airport had only focused it. What had changed wasn't her heart. It was her direction. Meanwhile, the broader reforms that had begun in the wake of the Dunridge Airport incident continued to evolve, but not without pushback. As public attention drifted, resistance crept in. Some agencies began quietly questioning the costs of expanded training and external oversight. Others, especially security hardliners, framed civil rights protections as a potential threat to national safety. Still others simply wanted to return to the way things were. Malcolm Collins now faced his most difficult challenge yet, not initiating change, but protecting it. In meeting rooms, budget negotiations, and security briefings, he fought daily to keep the reforms alive, because he knew that real change wasn't just about what happened in the spotlight. It was about what endured once the cameras were gone. The fight wasn't over. Inside conference rooms and high-level briefings, Malcolm Collins found himself defending reforms that, to him, were not experiments, but essential corrections. In one particularly charged cabinet meeting, the Secretary of Transportation suggested it might be time to return to more practical protocols. With all due respect, Madam Secretary, Malcolm said, his tone measured but firm. What you're calling an experiment is, in reality, the correct application of constitutional principles to national security policy. He gestured toward the briefing document in front of him. The data from the past 18 months shows fewer civil rights complaints, better passenger satisfaction, and improved threat detection, because we focused on behavior, not appearance. The room went quiet. The tension was unmistakable. It was a different kind of battlefield, one where reform lived or died in footnotes, data charts, and internal memos. But Malcolm had learned how much weight a quiet truth could carry. He'd seen it in his daughter's eyes. Elsewhere, Connor Blake had found himself walking an unexpected road of his own. After completing his participation in the reform program, he turned down lucrative offers from private security firms. Instead, he joined a civil rights nonprofit, one focused on law enforcement reform. His background, equal parts field experience and first-hand reckoning, made him uniquely equipped to help. And in a twist no one could have foreseen, 2 years earlier, Connor was now consulting for the same department he had once represented so poorly. He and Malcolm didn't pretend it wasn't strange. Their working relationship was formal, respectful, and cautiously collaborative. There were no illusions about the past, but there was a shared belief in repairing what had been broken. 18 months after the incident at Dunridge International, a new opportunity emerged that tested how far the Collins family had come. A prominent documentary filmmaker reached out. The project aimed to explore the evolution of civil liberties in the post-9/11 era, placing Amira's story into the larger landscape of race, security, and public accountability. The offer promised thoughtful, nuanced storytelling. It was more than exposure. It was a chance to cement the legacy of change born from pain. But it also risked bringing Amira back into the public eye at a moment when she was working to build an identity beyond that singular event. As always, the family made the decision together. And as always, they centered Amira's voice. "I want to help tell the story," she said, "but I don't want to be the story again." They agreed to limited participation. Malcolm would be interviewed on the policy implications. Amira's words would be included, but in her own way. Written reflections, narrated by the filmmaker, set against imagery of bustling airports and quiet moments of travel. When the documentary was released, it was met with critical acclaim. Amira's reflections, paired with silent footage of travelers and security lines, became some of the film's most impactful moments. One line in particular echoed across social media. "Safety isn't just about being protected from threats. It's also about being protected from injustice." For the Collins family, the documentary provided a strange kind of closure. Not an ending, but a framing. A way to understand that those few terrifying minutes in an airport terminal had reshaped their entire lives and changed systems far beyond their reach. Unexpectedly, the film also reignited public interest in Connor Blake's story. Multiple media outlets requested interviews, hoping to explore how a former officer had gone from enforcing flawed policies to helping dismantle them. After discussing with his therapist, a support he'd leaned on heavily through his transition, Connor agreed to one interview. It would be honest, uncomfortable, and necessary. In the published piece, Connor spoke candidly. "I was trained in a system that encouraged suspicion, not of behavior, but of people who looked a certain way. There were no memos, no official rules, just knowing glances, quiet cues. You'll learn who to watch." It wasn't written, but it was understood. He paused. "I used to think those instincts made me better at my job, but what I've learned is that they actually made me worse. I wasn't focusing on risk. I was reacting to bias, and I hurt people because of it." In his interview, Connor Blake hadn't tried to defend his past. "Those instincts didn't make me a better officer," he said. "They made me a worse one. They trained me to react to what someone looked like, instead of watching how they behaved." When asked about Amira Collins, he didn't flinch. "I failed. Professionally, morally. And while my own redemption isn't the point, what matters is that the system has started to change, not to soothe the guilt of officers like me, but to prevent others from making the same mistakes." The article didn't sugarcoat his misconduct, but it also didn't ignore the honest work he was doing now. The public reaction was mixed. Some saw it as an undeserved second chance. Others respected the rare humility. But for Connor, public opinion mattered less than personal accountability. He wasn't looking for praise. He was trying to tip the scales in whatever way he could. As Amira's 13th birthday approached, the Collins family made a decision they had put off for far too long. They needed a break. No press, no advocacy, no work. Just the three of them. They booked a remote beach cottage, no television, no internet, and packed light. For 10 blissful days they swam, built crooked sand castles, read dog-eared paperbacks, and fell asleep to the sound of the ocean. For Amira, it was a return to something she hadn't realized she missed. Being a kid, she raced waves, collected seashells, stargazed with her parents from a blanket in the sand, and for a while, the noise faded. On their last night, as the sun melted into the sea, Lena asked the question that had been quietly on her mind all week. Has it been nice to take a break from everything back home? Amira dug her toes into the cool sand and thought for a long moment. Yes, she said honestly. But I don't think I want to take a break from who I am now, even when it's complicated. Malcolm looked at her, his voice gentle. And who is that? Amira turned toward the waves, her face caught in the golden light. Someone who knows what it feels like when the world isn't fair, and someone who knows she can do something about it. Her parents exchanged a quiet glance, equal parts pride and heartache. In those words was the end of something and the beginning of something else. A childhood innocence had been traded for a deeper awareness, but in its place was something powerful: conviction. Their daughter wasn't just growing up. She was growing into her purpose. Back home, they returned to their respective roles. Malcolm, still fighting to keep reform efforts alive in boardrooms and behind closed doors. Lena, returning to her groundbreaking work in cardiovascular research. And Amira, back to middle school hallways, science fairs, and her ever-expanding advocacy club. The airport incident would always be part of their family's story. But it was only one chapter, and the chapters that followed were theirs to write. For Amira, the girl in the lavender dress, who had found her voice in a moment of crisis, the road ahead was filled with both challenge and possibility. She knew now that some people would always try to define her by what had happened to her, but she had chosen instead to define herself by what she had done about it. And far beyond her neighborhood, travelers continued passing through security lines, now shaped by quiet but powerful reforms. To most, they seemed like small improvements. But for those who knew, the officers who had retrained, the families who no longer feared the checkpoint, it was personal. It was change. The lavender dress had long since been donated, outgrown like any favorite outfit. But its meaning lingered. No longer a symbol of vulnerability, it had become a banner of resilience. What had once marked the beginning of trauma now marked the beginning of transformation. And for Amira Collins, that transformation wasn't just personal. It was a reminder that systems are made by people, and people can change them. Even the most entrenched problems can shift when courage meets opportunity. There is meaning, even in our most difficult moments. Growth doesn't happen in spite of pain, but because of it. And when we choose to share what we've endured, our personal stories can become catalysts for something greater than ourselves. For director Malcolm Collins, the incident at Dunridge International had redefined his role. He no longer saw himself as just an enforcer of national security policy. He was now the guardian of a system that must protect all citizens equally, regardless of race, age, or circumstance. The tension between safety and freedom was no longer theoretical. It was personal. Because it had happened to his daughter. Because he had seen the cost. The story didn't end at the airport, or in the hearings, or on the front pages. It kept unfolding, quietly, in places few would ever see. New training rooms, revised screening manuals, school board meetings, and family dinners. From a single moment of injustice came not just healing, but real, if imperfect, systemic change. And at the heart of it all remained one enduring truth. That justice begins with seeing each human being as worthy of dignity, respect, and equal protection, no matter what they look like, where they come from, or how old they are. Now stepping into adolescence with clarity beyond her years, Amira Collins was no longer seen by her family as a victim. She had become an advocate, not a symbol to be displayed, but a voice to be heard. And her story? No longer defined by the incident, but by what she chose to do after. The lavender dress, once drenched in fear and misjudgment, had become a reminder of her strength, a quiet emblem of everything she had reclaimed: her voice, her identity, her future. And in that evolution was the greatest hope of all: that even our hardest experiences hold the power to transform not just ourselves, but the world around us. The journey toward justice is never truly finished, but each step matters. Each voice raised, no matter how young, no matter how small, can ripple outward. A kind word, a question asked, a stand taken. These moments of courage, however brief, carry within them the seeds of lasting change. In the years that followed, Amira continued to grow. She faced new challenges, discovered new passions, asked bigger questions. But she never forgot what that day in the terminal had taught her: that doing what's right, even when it's hard, is not just a choice, it's a responsibility. And so, the story of the girl in the lavender dress became something more than a lesson or a headline. It became a testament to the power of truth, to the strength of a single voice in a moment of injustice, to the enduring belief that from pain can come purpose, and from that purpose, progress. For the Collins family, and for everyone whose lives had been touched by the story, that truth became a compass, a commitment to act with courage, to listen with compassion, and to keep pressing forward even when the finish line is nowhere in sight. The lavender dress, now long outgrown, had fulfilled its quiet destiny, no longer just fabric, but a banner of resistance, of resilience, of hope. And in that transformation lies the story's greatest truth: that the impact of our actions is not measured only in the moment they occur, but in the ripples they leave behind. Ripples that reach places we'll never see. Ripples that bend the arc of history, not through force, but through decency, courage, and the refusal to stay silent.